boy, do we have a good panel for you to round out the day. Man, I am very excited about this one. I've actually been looking forward to this panel. No offense to my other panels of the day, which were all excellent and amazing, but I've been looking forward to this one for a while.
You probably said that at all your panels.
No, only for this one. I mean, come on, we go back so far. So we're going to be talking about China, and I'd like to sort of China and US and startups and investments and artificial intelligence. And I'm going to try to keep it at a fairly high level because there's so much ground to cover. Luckily, we have an amazing panel to talk about it with. Hans is very humble, but you should know he's on the Midas list. He's an investor with GGV, and he's been investing in China for, what, how many years now? A decade more? 20 years? 80 years?
2005.
2005, 13 years. Norman Liang is a serial entrepreneur over at the end, is a serial entrepreneur, and he's now an investor with W.I. Harper, which has a long and storied history of investing in the China market. And last, but certainly not least, in the center is Wang, who is the chief executive officer of LingoChamp, which is a wildly successful education startup out of China that is going to go public or has filed to go public in the US, but we're not going to talk about that at all because they're in a quiet period. So nothing about that. I'd like to start off with the sort of ways in which capital has been deployed in China recently, and what seems to be an increasing number of like mega rounds for companies there. And Norman and Hans, I'd like to start with you two and get your take on why there seem to be an accelerating number of increasingly large investments for rather early stage companies in China these days. And take it away, guys. Norman, do you want to start?
I mean, I think there's always a willingness to pay it forward, no matter what, right? Every entrepreneur, part of the dream of being successful is being able to support other entrepreneurs. And I think a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs are no different. As they've built these massive platforms that now connect people across the country, they're now looking to take their profits and their investable dollars and put it back to work towards the next big thing. I think Chinese entrepreneurs are not afraid to displace themselves. They're not afraid to place those bets outside of their companies and bet on new entrepreneurs. And so you see large internet players, the Tencents, the Alibabas, and the Baidus of the world, really investing in a lot of the strategic growth rounds to help these companies scale. In addition to that, they work very closely with the ecosystem, and they've been very, very active in their efforts to stay close with the ecosystem.
Is also part of it a competitive moat, Hans? I mean, do you find that people are committing capital in the way that SoftBank is committing capital as to sort of make a kingmaker or anoint a king in a particular market and create some sort of capital moat around potential competitors and move quickly? Or
I think there's a little bit of a chicken and egg kind of dynamics going on. As Chinese sort of PC internet user base grew throughout the 2000s, and then since 2010, mobile internet users growing. You now have 750 million smartphone internet users, over 900 million desktop PC internet users, and then a GDP per capita of about $9,000. You have an amazing market and base to grow. So that coupled with the rise of middle class and the urbanization, speed of urbanization in China, makes it a lot easier to build businesses that can scale quickly. So as people see that you can scale business more quickly, whether it's in the case of BAT, and then after that you have Meituan, Didi, Xiaomi, JD, ByteDance, all around that similar valuation of $50–60 billion, you start to see that other companies realize that you can scale business quickly. Therefore, people are willing to invest earlier and even overpay earlier to get in, because the ones that work out can expand and get to an enormous size in a short period of time. Pinduoduo, which was publicly traded a few weeks ago, started less than 3 years ago with their second product. And the second product scaled to $20 billion US in annual revenue in a span of 2.5 years. And that kind of scale, $20 billion US annualized revenue, you just don't see that anywhere else in the world. So that fuels the valuation increase on stuff as early, because if it works out, great. If it doesn't, who cares?
Right.
So it almost builds in incentive to be more aggressive. And BAT sees that, especially Alibaba and Tencent. They're willing to invest earlier than ever before to help to scale it to achieve critical mass as quickly as possible.
Now,
The level of intensity of competition between the two, between Ali and Tencent, is so strong, makes it even easier for both camps to pump money into two different ecosystems
Right.
of startups fighting against each other to grab market share, which further fuels that valuation increase.
Wang, did you see those kinds of tensions at work when you raised like $100 million, what, a year ago or so? Did you see those tensions at work as you were building your own business there in China, or?
Well, I mean, when we raised capital, we had the choice of raising money from some of the so-called strategic investors, but we did not choose to, because we thought, there are a lot more benefits of staying independent in our case. But around my friend circle, definitely a lot of companies, when they reach like Series C or D, chances are they are gonna, take sides. Because if you look at the stats, I think Ali and Tencent are two of the most
Active.
with the most capital invested. Like they are the ones who are making the big bets. And I was, at the main stage somewhere when there was another panel talking about there are fewer exits in the U.S. in recent years. But I think in China, it's not the case. Like these guys, they are buying companies just like flipping pancake.
And why does that sort of put a cap on the opportunity set in a market? I mean, would you, if there's this bifurcation or this division between sort of two sides where you have to choose, and everyone is so acquisitive, both companies are so hyper acquisitive, does that make, and maybe this is an investor question so we can avoid getting into SEC trouble, does that make capital markets in the US look more attractive for Chinese companies that want to go it alone and try to scale to $1 billion, multi-billion dollar?
From a pure logic standpoint, that seems very plausible as a theory.
But it's not true.
But if you look at number of sort of 40 to $60 billion market cap companies, whether public or private, between US and China, that are starting in the last 5 years. China has Xiaomi, JD, Meituan, Didi, Pinduoduo, ByteDance. That's 6. In the US, Airbnb and Uber. That's it.
Right.
And so that wasn't the case 5 years ago. But in the last 5 years, because of all the factors we mentioned earlier, it has become a very different world. And now the next big wave, besides AI and then autonomous driving and EV, is actually just growing, building business on top of WeChat. WeChat has become a default operating system. Doesn't matter if you use an Android phone or iOS, WeChat is everywhere on all platforms. So now people are building the next Alibaba, the next Taobao, next Tmall on top of WeChat. So it's fueling even another wave of growth coming. Pinduoduo being the biggest beneficiary of that.
Norman, if you think about the ways in which so we've done a very cursory map of some of the things that are happening in the China market. Do you see that influencing the ways that Chinese capital is getting deployed in the U.S. at all as well, or do you see? How are you thinking about that dichotomy between the investments domestically and investment abroad from big Chinese companies?
I think that internationally here, big Chinese companies, the last 3 months have been noticeably quiet, and probably the last 2 years have really been quiet. And that's really been simply because of the case. It's harder to move larger amounts of money due to capital controls. They have to leverage their existing businesses and their existing revenues to be able to finance some of these larger deals abroad. And then their strategic interests, it's a matter of focus. Their core businesses are much larger in the US. These opportunities here in the US represent growth opportunities for them. And a lot of these entrepreneurs see huge opportunities both domestically and abroad, and they believe in a global opportunity. But to Hans's point, part of it is about the theory and part of it is about the practice. How do they actually do this? And there have been a lot more things to navigate in terms of the regulatory environment on both sides to enable and facilitate these types of transactions. And there's been a lot more attention paid to it as both companies are vying to be #1 in technology and innovation.
Wang, you've built a successful business in China. A lot of American companies look at going abroad or trying to enter the China market, and they just fail completely. I mean, I can't think of a single company, with maybe the exception of like Cloudflare, that's doing enterprise stuff, or Microsoft, that's actually gained any traction in the China market.
Airbnb's doing pretty well.
They're doing okay.
They're growing fast.
They're doing okay.
We like it.
All right. Well, as long as you're happy, Hans. As long as you're happy, I'm happy. But when you look at that sort of phenomenon, what advice would you give to American entrepreneurs that are trying to crack the China market? Should they even think about it? Is it better to not? I mean, how?
Well, it's always. I think as entrepreneurs, I think just standing in their shoes, I think it's always attractive. To tackle such a big market, right? So I think I have no rights to say no to them, but I think there are a few things, they should probably watch out. Number one, I think that the market dynamic is definitely different. The consumers are very, very different. If you take any comparable app like Uber and Didi or DoorDash, right, and Meituan, just open up the app and just play with it. You will see like the design, the user experience, they're just very, very different. That's the nature. And the market is so huge and unique, so you probably would want to at least set up a separate team or have dedicated people just learning about the user behavior, really, iterate on its own pace even. Or I think that's, probably point number one. Number two is, the competition is really fierce. Hans, GGV has a famous podcast called 996, right? How many people here know about 996, what it means?
It's actually really great.
Right?
Good
So,
podcast.
yeah. Most people don't. So it's about 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. That's how a lot of, I'm not saying all, but a lot of Chinese startups, how they work, right? So it's fierce competition. People, obviously, even though the salary level has increased over the years, but still, the salary level is lower in China versus the US. So at the same time, Chinese company startups, thanks to all the great investors here, right? They are able to raise, if not more, similar, level of capital. That means they are able to afford to hire more people at competitive rates. So I think the competition is just very, very fierce.
Mm-hmm. So more competitive. You didn't really say that anything really positive for you. But Hans, you've actually invested in a company, Wish, that's managed to sort of mediate both the U.S. and Chinese market, leveraging sort of Chinese manufacturing and Chinese suppliers to sell into the U.S. market. Is that the model? Is it really sort of taking aspects that work well in one country and then leveraging that in another? Another example would be VIP Kids, right, where they're using U.S. teachers
Resources, yeah.
to educate Chinese students in English.
So I'm involved with 3 companies that try to take Chinese resources and do it well here. That's Wish in cross-border e-commerce. That's Liang doing bike sharing, scooter sharing in the U.S. And then also Musically has been sold to ByteDance,
Right.
which is also has merged Musically into TikTok, and TikTok is expanding globally. So you do see Chinese company doing that, and these 3 you can all play with in the U.S. But that's more of a minority. Most Chinese companies, the first market they think about is Southeast Asia. Then comes maybe India, Middle East, Eastern Europe, and maybe different parts of Latin America, starting with Brazil. So those are sort of the kind of the path that a Chinese company go out. It's very similar, we talked about this before, with in the 15th century, 14th century, when the Chinese naval fleets were going out, trying to explore the world in the Ming Dynasty with Amor-Jen. That was the route that it took from Southeast Asia to India, Arab, and then to East Africa. Some say even further, but that's a different story. So you see that these emerging markets have urbanized. They have rising middle class. A lot of the problems they're trying to solve with technology and internet are problems that China has solved over the last 10 years. So we hear constantly entrepreneurs from Southeast Asia and India come to China and talk to us and ask us questions, ask founders questions on figuring out how to apply that model for their local markets. And we just made our first investments in Latin America, and the team in Brazil, Yellow, knows exactly how the system works in China. They sold their previous startup in '99 to Didi. So it is impressive to see that more and more founders around the world are learning not just from the US market, but also from the Chinese market now.
Why are you jumping ahead, Hans? I had a whole thing planned out. We were going to do this thing. All right. Well, Norman, so when you look at your portfolio, how have you seen, what successes have you seen, and how have they managed to leverage both aspects or the context of operating in both markets, in the US and in China?
A lot of what we've seen has been partnership driven. It's been B2B to C. There have been some type of relationships or some type of mediation, some type of sharing of information and knowledge put towards a single product and trying to build and localize that. When we were inside of Fox Interactive Media and launching MySpace in China, that was a completely separate entity. That was a completely separate business that was put together. It had a lot of the same UI and a lot of the same aesthetics, but I wonder how many people in this room still remember MySpace.
I remember MySpace.
It's a place for friends.
Well, we should all be on it then.
In China, it was an experiment in content, bringing that content from the global portfolio, putting that into China. It was capitalized, invested in by local investors, IDG being the main investor in that. And a whole new team was brought in. There were some people who were brought in to project manage and make sure that certain things were working. But for all intents and purposes, everything had to be brought over piece by piece, put together, and launched with a whole separate license, a whole separate company that was actually running the show. All that we had was a brand and some features and some code that were running on local machines in the world separately in China.
Right. Speaking of sort of localizing in China and sort of what's going on, well, from a global context, I'm curious whether y'all see any impact, whether you think that the current trade war will have any impact on tech development or cross-border either transactions or development for companies that would like to move into the U.S. market or vice versa, enter the China market. And I guess, Wang, if you want to, I know that y'all are thinking about internationalization, and it's something that's in the road for you. Do you have any sense of what the ramifications of this trade war are for the tech community?
Well, we are a B2C company. Most of our users are, at least today, are based in China. So we don't yet feel a lot of pressure from that. But from a talent perspective, we do have an AI lab here established about a year ago, right here in San Mateo. So that's where we have some very talented AI scientists who don't yet have the intention to move to China. We would just have them here working on some of the interesting problems. So I think we do see a lot of such actions from Chinese companies. They wanted to the extent possible, tap into the talent pool here in the U.S. and really build either their product targeted either at the China market or global market. That's what I see.
Hans, anything happening with either Wish or some of the other?
I think over the last 5 years, definitely see a lot of Chinese companies setting up labs here. And before, Chinese engineers who are from China tend to want to work at a Facebook or LinkedIn and Airbnb and Uber. Increasingly, more and more are willing to work in Chinese startup and help Chinese companies to globalize, which is very interesting, and it's a phenomenon we highly encourage.
But will there be any impact from the trade war on some of the economics from some of the businesses that you've already invested in? Or?
Surprisingly, I mean, a lot of people ask us that question, but surprisingly, even with companies like Wish, where they ran analysis, even with the tariff, the impact on the final purchase price is still minimal. If something is, cost $5, now it's $5.50,
Right.
or $7. There's really not much difference in terms of how the consumer behave at the end of the day. The impact is minimal.
And is that something that you've seen as well? Norman?
I'd say that what we see at the Series A is it's just a matter of focus. A lot of the companies are just staying focused. They really think about that as something that's more of a longer-term plan. And so the trade wars have basically just given them some parameters that have forced them to focus, put their heads down and get back to work, focus on the market they're in, and build the business that they have. And so we've seen that basically a lot of our portfolio at the seed and Series A has stopped talking about rapid global expansion,
Right.
launching internationally, building foreign teams. They've said, for now, we're going to figure out what we've got, make it work, make it scale, and then when the market's ready, we'll continue to address that at that point.
Hans, you mentioned your first investment in Latin America and how global entrepreneurs are increasingly looking to Shanghai and Beijing and Shenzhen as places to learn from rather than necessarily Silicon Valley. So Norman and Yi, do you think that the Valley has lost a step? There was an Economist article about this recently as well. Is Silicon Valley behind the curve now?
I'll go first.
I mean, I think the first thing that we saw was just earlier, we saw a group of Silicon Valley VCs talk about how hard it is for their companies to just grow in Silicon Valley, competing against the large tech giants that are here for people, for space. A lot of our startups that are here can't even keep the buildings that they're in because their buildings are getting acquired by some unknown holding company. It turns out that it's going to be a campus for some larger company.
Or Airbnb rooms, right?
Might turn into apartments for their employees. But what we see is that same type of thing is starting to happen. And in Silicon Valley, I think a lot of folks are getting back to work, but I think it's even different when you go from San Francisco to San Jose. You really see these companies really continuing to thrive and grow and focus. But at the same time, I think that Silicon Valley isn't losing its edge and isn't losing its focus. It's still in an awkward teenage phase trying to figure out where its focus should be. And a lot of that has shifted to where the dollars are as opposed to what markets people believe in.
I'm obviously biased, right? So I have been focusing a lot more on the China market instead of the Valley. I do come back I used to work here at Google, but these days I come back 4 to 5 times a year. I have a few observations. Number one, the Valley has become so expensive, right? As the other panel pointed out. So you have the natural spill-out effect where you have companies moving out even to the other parts of the states, and so I think that may be good, at a higher level, right, for the whole country. But we do see more and more, Chinese engineers, moving back to China, right, to join startups. That's also good, from the China startup perspective. I think that's just, the Valley sort of giving back to the broader society in a way. But then, the other thing I kind of observed is that I think innovations come in waves. Okay, so I'm kind of looking forward to the next big wave of breakthroughs from the Valley, where I think most of entrepreneurs in China still think is the biggest innovation center in terms of core technology. So be it in IoT or biotech or you name it. So I think. And AI, right? So I think it still has its glow, but I think just we are seeing a lot more distribution of talent elsewhere, I think that's actually a good thing.
What's interesting to me is that the regulatory environment in China, in some ways, is a little bit more forgiving
More
for
open.
some kinds of companies than you see in the U.S., which is something. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, but yeah, I mean, when I was in Latin America last month,
Right.
a lot of the startups that I talked to were saying that that they weren't looking to the U.S. at all, and that given their regulatory regimes and the things that they had going on, China was a much more relevant market for them to look at and to model themselves after than anything that the States had going on, which was interesting to hear. We are unfortunately officially out of time. I might have even run over, but I will open the floor. If anyone wants to tweet at me with a question or two, I will take the best one and pose it to the panel. If there are no questions, also my Twitter handle, JSHIEBER, and this pads my user count, which is great. Then I feel better about myself. I'm validated by the number of Twitter users I have. But if someone has one or two questions, I will field them. If not, I would say thank you very much for paying attention. Thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful panel. Let me see what's going on here. No, everyone's shy. All right, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for participating. It was really great. I thank you all.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.